Now I know you read the title of this video and are thinking, I've maybe officially lost it, but I promise you I haven't. And I asked you to stick around because since I started making this video, I have discovered 5 new names to add to the list of what I originally thought were just 3 people. Every single one of these 8 people pretty clearly had their lives cut short by something, and I've labeled it as, quote, the government, because only something of that magnitude could be carrying this out. I find that very interesting because these aren't just random people on the street. These are some of America's most talented and gifted minds, many of whom are literal geniuses, people who the government invested decades and hundreds of millions of dollars into developing, and rightfully so, as their names are on some of the most advanced technology to have ever graced this planet. But they are also the sorts of people who could refute any story the government might be trying to come out with in the near-term future about quote-unquote aliens. Now, no matter what you believe, this story is still very relevant. If you think aliens come from Washington, D.C., or Mars, or something in between, these are all people who would have been deeply involved in the research proving your side. And so when you have arguably America's greatest minds just disappearing or being found, I can't say that word for a couple more minutes, but brutally ended on their front porch, you'd expect a full-scale government operation investigating these people who have all the secrets of the American government in their brains. And yet there's been almost the exact opposite. It would seem like there is an intentional cover-up to make these strange demises all seem like accidents or normal occurrences. As such, I think it's important to realize that in this area of quote-unquote aliens and UFOs, there's a very wide range of beliefs, from people who believe aliens are little green men from other planets here to bring us technology, to aliens were a figment created by the US government or mastered by the US government in the post-World War II world, and that there's really no such thing as aliens, but only advanced spacecraft that's been kept secret for the purpose of carrying out some large psychological operation. For instance, Wernher von Braun warned us that the last card they are going to try and pull is the aliens one. Wernher von Braun being arguably the most important mind in spaceflight in all of human history. So no matter what end of that spectrum you fall into, this is very important to understand because there are 4 locations that are going to matter most for this story, and these are 4 places where this research into UFOs has been occurring, and subsequently where these clusters of mysterious deaths have also been occurring. That would be NASA's JPL, or Jet Propulsion Laboratory in California, the Los Alamos National Laboratory, Kirtland Air Force Base, and in the great state of Ohio, my home state, you have Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Each of these is a unique piece of the puzzle, doing the most high-tech and advanced research that happens in the entire world of aerospace. And over the past several decades, they've also become synonymous with secret government programs, and yes, even aliens and alien technology, with both Kirtland Air Force Base and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base being the likely and basically even reported destinations for the wreckage of the original 1947 Roswell spacecraft crash, which began this whole age of flying saucers and aliens and investigation. Both of these bases are believed to not only house the wreckage of the spacecraft, they are also believed to house the actual bodies of people, or really creatures, from other planets. But that would be a rabbit hole for another time. It's important to bring this up though, because these 2 bases are the sites of some of the most disturbing cases you have not heard of and that have been almost completely unreported by the media. Cases involving names that are extremely well known in their field and vital to the development of American technology and pressing us into the next generation of spacecraft, and names that for decades were integral to the entire operation of the United States Air Force and research and development. And rambling over, because I believe we've gone long enough to avoid any detection, let's start naming names and talking about some cases. These are the stories of the people who were very likely snuffed out because of everything they knew, but I do want to first mention that it is a bit ironic that the most advanced aircraft technology and research and weapons programs are coming out of these same places that are believed to house extraterrestrial aircraft. That being said, let's get into it. And so the first man on this list is the one whose strange end has ignited growing speculation online that something big is about to happen. And that would be General Neil McCassland. This is his story. Neil McCassland, a 69-year-old man, is a now retired general who over the course of his lifetime oversaw the most, literally the most, and I mean this 100% legitimately, the most advanced aerospace research in the entire world. He had a $4.4 billion budget, which he allocated to the most cutting edge of technologies. In one speech telling his peers that he was preparing the Air Force for the 2030s, 40s, and 50s, developing technology now, technology that he may never even see to fruition, but that he knows we need in order to stay on top. A man with security clearances for his security clearances, quite literally the man with the secrets who knows all of the hidden things at these bases, and who throughout his tenure was commander of multiple different installations, and during his tenure was the commander of the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which from the 1950s to the 1960s housed a program known as Project Blue Book, in which the government cataloged and collected data and materials from 12,000 UFO reports across about a decade from around the country. These reports were then cataloged, the information sealed, and no one except for people like Neil McCassland ever really got to see it. He was commander of Kirtland Air Force Base and Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Both bases, as we mentioned, are believed to contain the wreckage from the ROSWELL incident and basically all other wreckage from any UFO incident over the past 80 years. He is also a man who has contributed to multiple UFO projects and, as we shall see later on, was very curious in this world of unidentified flying objects and what they might truly be, or possibly what they might truly be used for, as he likely knew who and what was behind them. But the first day of his life worth mentioning to us was on February 27th of 2026, a little under 1 month ago as of recording. On that day, from the outside, seemingly like any other, Neil McCassland would leave his home in New Mexico and head out for the day. Indeed, it was a day like any other for a man who had such an incredible track record but was now retired. I dare say the most eventful thing coming for him that day was the plumber at 11 a.m. And so when his wife returned around noon or so and found that her husband wasn't home, she was a little confused, as she'd become accustomed to seeing that the man who was once gone at all hours was now always around. And so she was almost immediately a little concerned with what could be going on with him. And as the minutes turned to hours, that bit of concern and confusion grew into something much bigger as she realized that she doesn't think he's coming back. And she also noticed some very small but creepy details in the home. Details which will make more sense in a second, because initially when she called the police, there was actually a very big investigation that was begun for him, including helicopters, drones, search teams, FLIR. They were scanning everywhere in the Sandia foothills, searching for any sign of this man. But there was nothing. Literally not a single sign he had ever existed. The only possible blip on the radar was a sweatshirt about 1.25 miles from his house that no one was ever able to actually confirm belonged to him. So this man had vanished truly without a trace. And so right off the bat, we have a man with the highest level information in the entire country just disappearing from his house. That automatically raises alarms for me. And so let's talk about some of those weird details that I mentioned earlier about this case. What really tipped off Neil's wife that right away something was wrong and was not right with him was when she walked inside the house, she noticed his personal belongings were sitting on the table. And that was very odd because Neil never goes anywhere without his personal belongings. It's the stuff you bring with you every day. His wallet was on the table, his phone was on the table, his watch was on the table, a smartwatch of some kind, as well as some other knickknacks that he liked to carry with him. What the wife noticed though, being a military wife and the wife of a top secret, literally one of the highest ranking guys in the entire US military kind of wife, was that he had left all of his traceable technology at home. And she got a gut feeling that right away this was not a good sign. Anything that could have been used to track where he was left at home. And so sitting here, I'm probably sure you're wondering why you haven't heard this story before, and if you have, why there's been so little investigation. I briefly mentioned earlier that almost right away there was a pretty huge police response to this disappearance, and that might seem like a good thing, but at the same time it's once again a little bizarre because when the police came and searched, it didn't last very long. Very quickly the police dropped off and all of this effort to find Neil dissipated into basically nothing. So in just a few days, it went from, oh man, let's find this guy, to, well, I guess there's no clues, let's go home and pack it up, which is gonna be a theme for multiple of the people on this list. And I do gotta wonder, once again, let's reiterate, this is a guy with the most advanced military knowledge. I would suspect that the FBI and any federal investigation institution would be on top of this thing, making sure that he didn't just get abducted by a foreign country for all the information he has. But no, it really doesn't seem that way. In fact, Kash Patel was busy tweeting about him getting hammered with the US hockey team rather than, you know, helping to try and find this guy with all the resources he has access to. Indeed, you'd probably notice there was almost no media attention about this entire thing, despite a man whose mind is a national treasure just disappearing from his home on a random day. Even stranger so, there was also very little private effort to find Neil. Recalling the fact that Neil was retired, I will add that that is really just a blanket term because Neil was only retired from the military in the most official sense. He had taken on the role of being a director at a defense contracting firm, which had just recently won some hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts, and was also appointed to the board of a research firm also used in the Defense Department industry. So he was retired in the official sense, but he was really still very active in the military world. But none of these companies seem to have scrambled much in terms of effort to try and find him, kind of just assuming he really had vanished. Despite this being a man who, through his efforts, had helped build a series of companies up to the point of winning hundreds of millions of dollars in annual contracts from the American government. Even without his official titles, he was still a prominent player in this world. And there was almost nothing in the private institutional sense about him either. Few to no friends came forward. None of these companies hosted volunteer search times. None of these companies invested in volunteer groups to try and get them to go search for Neil. They just kind of let him disappear. And so now it's been about a month and nothing has come from the investigation into Neil, despite the initial efforts of the police and the later efforts of some straggling volunteers. So I think it's worth us re-looking into his history and the projects he was funding. As I mentioned, Neil served as the director of the Air Force's Research and Development Program, which allocated him a budget of about $4.4 billion per year to invest in what he saw fit. The goal being to advance us as far and as fast as possible. As such, there are a ton of programs that could have made Neil a target, and I mean a lot of them. But there is one that stands out the most because it has a connection to someone else. And it's really only because of this other connection that we have an idea that Neil really was likely taken in some capacity. And so oddly enough, it's not his laser technology development, his hypersonic aircraft or weapons, or his development of spacecraft that is the blackest of budgets where no one, except for a few eyes, ever really knows what's going on. It is actually really kind of strangely because of the development of a material that many online and myself speculate that Neil was disappeared. And this material is named Mandeloy. Without going too far into the weeds, it is an ultra-strong alloy that is capable of withstanding heats that would normally just completely incinerate steel, and it was designed for use on the latest and most cutting-edge aircraft and spacecraft that are designed for national security missions, including the launches of secret government operations into space. Take that as you will. This Mandeloy material was developed by a woman named Monica Reza. Monica is a gifted mind, that is for sure, and it would be this giftedness that has also put her on this list. And it's also because of Monica's strange fate that we, like I said, know something certainly happened to Neil. During his tenure leading the Air Force's research and development budget, like we said, Neil funded a lot of projects. But as would turn out, he was also very much involved in the funding and ensuring of the development of this Mandeloy material and is directly connected to Monica Reza. And now let's get into Monica's story. Monica Reza was 4'11", in her 60s and was an avid outdoorsman. And as such, it should be no surprise that on June 22nd of 2025, she went for a nice hike with two friends. And on that day, she contemplated very possibly the irony that the government claims anything as national security that pushes the bounds and concepts of our current understanding of how things work. But her time to contemplate this phenomena would be very, very short that day, because while she was hiking with her friends, something would happen. Specifically, this was Mount Waterman in the Angeles National Forest, during which time she waved at a friend about 30 feet in front of her, and then that friend, after not hearing or seeing Monica for a while, decided to walk back, and about 10 minutes after having seen her and waving at her, this friend noticed that they couldn't find Monica. So they decided to walk it all the way back down to the beginning of the trail to make sure nothing had happened to Monica, knowing that there really was very little to injure oneself on, and there was nothing that could really make you disappear on this trail or could cause deadly injury. So this friend thought maybe Monica had walked back to the beginning of the trail because she started feeling ill or something like that. And so on the entire walk, they were on the lookout for Monica, and yet not a single time did they make any sighting of Monica whatsoever. In fact, when this person made it all the way back down to the beginning of the trail, they met up with another friend who was at the base of the trail waiting on them, and that friend, once told that Monica wasn't there, was also equally surprised because they were the ride for Monica. They had all carpooled there, so Monica couldn't have just left by herself, and there's no way she could have seemingly gotten around them or somehow gone into a different trail without them knowing. These friends thought it was incredibly bizarre and decided to go search again to make sure Monica wasn't hurt and was just off the trail in a place they hadn't seen the first time. And upon the second walkthrough, likely while they were reassuring themselves, they began to get the deep and disturbing realization that Monica was gone. She was nowhere to be found. She had literally completely vanished, without a single trace of her being found. So they called the police, and the police, much like Neil McCassland, immediately sent up drones, helicopters, search teams, cadaver dogs, only to find that there was nothing. They even used FLIR and some color recognition software and satellite imagery and all sorts of other tech to try and search for the color of Monica's jacket, and found nothing except for some balloons that were spread out across the trail that matched Monica's last known outfit. That being a weird detail, but I thought worth including. Continuing, in a short while, the police had basically confirmed what these friends had stated, that Monica had vanished into thin air. And oddly enough, just like the Neil McCassland case, there's believed to be one clothing item that was found this by a cadaver dog, and it was a beanie a pretty considerable distance from where Monica was last seen. The beanie, however, we aren't 100% certain was hers, but what's odd about that is that the cadaver dog only found the beanie by chance, and there was no scent trail leading to or from the beanie as far as we can tell. It's as if it was just plopped there out of thin air. So what happened to Monica is, to this day, almost a year later, as we approach June of 2026, is a complete mystery. Nothing has ever been found. But that does not mean that there is not more information for us to go on. Let me begin telling you some of the strange details around this case. Monica, as we know, was in a great spirit with her friends, going about her day. There were no signs that anything was wrong with her. She was literally just doing her thing. It is unclear, though, what precisely her friends knew about what she did, as it was not exactly highly published that this was the woman developing the most advanced materials for a spacecraft. She had originally been working in a private sense for a private corporation and had been sort of extracted and placed into JPL, or that Jet Propulsion Laboratories we mentioned earlier on, to continue developing this technology within the purview of the government. So no matter what the friends knew, there was this palpable sense of oversight from the federal government, which I think is why there was such a big initial response in this investigation. However, that initial response, like I said, mirrors McCassland's, because it very quickly not only died out, but actually goes even further than the weirdness of McCassland's case, in that with Monica, the police and investigators had blocked off the search area and had prevented volunteers from searching while they were searching, which is not typical. In almost all the cases I've read about, there is an immediate organization of volunteers to cover the most ground possible to have the best chance of finding this victim as quickly as possible. And really the only reason you wouldn't do that is if you didn't want this person to be found. That's at least my speculation. Continuing on that note, the police and investigators only gave the search 8 days of effort before they said, no evidence, let's pack it up and go home, leaving the family just to wonder. And 8 days sounds like a very short amount of time for something of this magnitude, because it is. The typical search and rescue period for a missing persons is something like 2 weeks. I mean, they cut it at least 6 days short, and I think you'd put in a little bit more effort for someone who's developing the most, or some of the most advanced materials for a spacecraft on Earth. But even stranger than the fact that this search was cut so short is that there was a really weird occurrence in the middle of the investigation. About 4 days into it, a Find a Grave memorial popped up, you guessed it, for this very woman, Monica, and it said that she was buried and it had a green burial. And a green burial is when you just dig a hole in the ground and toss the body in and cover it up. Ugh, I'm getting chills saying that. I don't think I need to say why that's so strange, but continuing, it gets stranger because his account was attributed to some unknown individual, and that account would later be shut down. And the Find a Grave memorial given for Monica on the website would also later be closed down, and you can no longer access it. Fortunately though, I do have one screenshot of it, and you can see that it really did exist. And so whether or not this is someone marking and or making a joke about what had happened, what you make of that bizarre detail is up to you, but to have the police cut the investigation short, and 4 days before the shortened investigation ends, to have a weird memorial pop up online for her saying she'd been green burialed, I don't like looking past stuff that crazy. But I don't know what to make of it, except for the fact that it is just another crazy detail in a case as bizarre as this. Before we move on from Monica and Mandeloy, let's go one step further, and I'm going to wager that Monica is not the first person to lose their life in relation to this Mandeloy and what it represents for advanced technologies, as Monica had a partner in this whole tech development system, and her name was Dallas Hardwick. Dallas Hardwick randomly in 2012 contracted a fast-acting cancer and was deceased by 2014. I could go down the rabbit hole of strange deaths connected to people who knew too much, who happened to just get cancer at the wrong time and perish. It's called fast-acting cancers. You can look that up and find a whole list yourself. But at the risk of going down a tangent, let's continue. Monica would attribute Dallas's work on this project as being a huge part of why they succeeded in developing this new material. And Dallas is the third link in a triangle to this Mandeloy tech. That includes Neil McCassland, who was funding the development of Mandeloy and was funding the work directly that Monica Reza was doing. And what's interesting is Dallas Hardwick was actually an in-between, ensuring that all of the data coming from the laboratory was accurate and bringing back with new ideas on how to increase the performance of the material and bring it to the next level. Also, Dallas Hardwick, despite being on the forefront of her field, has one obituary of her online that I could find, and it's from another country. No one else seems to talk about her, and it's like she never existed. So that's not weird at all. And that right there was where I thought this story ended just a few days ago, with 3 people who, let's face it, all died under very weird circumstances. This bizarre story of 3 people who knew too much. Pretty clear notion that something is going on, and something related to Mandeloy and this program was never meant to get out. At least that's how I took it, right? But I was wrong. That is not where this ended. That is just the beginning. Because if one were to be trying to develop the next generation of aircraft, perhaps even these UFOs we've been seeing all over the skies, especially lately, you need more than just the materials to build the craft. You need propulsion systems, you need ultra advanced guidance systems, you need cloaking technology, you need the sorts of things that prevent you from being discovered unless you intend to be discovered. In other words, you need everything and then some from the tech community, in the science community, in the research community. You need the cutting edge and the best minds. And you also need people in places to ensure that these sorts of programs, what are known as black budget programs, don't get found out. And because of that, we now know that there is a rabbit hole. It goes beyond just these 3 people. And boy, I want you to prepare yourself. Click in the seatbelt, because we are gonna skirt around like Miss Frizzle in the intro to a Magic School Bus episode. Because it would appear that scientists with top secret level security clearances worked on the most covert, black budget, deep state, ultra high tech, cutting edge, bleeding edge sorts of programs just dropping dead is becoming the norm. As we're gonna introduce you to a man named Carl Grillmair, who met possibly the strangest end out of any we've discussed so far. A man with a resume as exceptional as his chin and beard, a guy who quite literally makes science look cool, and had he been my teacher, I probably would have liked it a lot more. However, unless you're in the world of astrophysics and the most advanced aerospace technologies, you've likely not only never heard this name, but you should. And it's kind of sad we don't hear more about these sorts of guys, because the things he's done are pretty incredible. Carl's resume is as long as my arm, and it is filled with grants, awards, positions, and just about everything one can imagine. He has about the most advanced and exceptional resume one can acquire in a single lifetime. A literal genius who has done everything from lab work to deep space government projects that likely won't ever be spoken about, and or whose records have already been destroyed. His work is so incredible. Carl Grillmair is the guy who first discovered water on another planet. He has also discovered other potential habitable planets. He's discovered space streams, which are like pathways throughout the stars. He has done some insanely cool stuff. He has also done things like developing asteroid detection programs, which are admittedly a little more run-of-the-mill now, but at his time were the bleeding edge of tech, because asteroids, they're very hard to distinguish because they are flush, as they emit no light, with the dark of the night sky. And so him and his team developed a system of using heat from the sun, which can just be a tiny minuscule amount, bouncing off of these asteroids to detect them via technologies on Earth. And his work was predicated on the theory of being able to detect these asteroids and help avert, via possible missile strikes or other systems, avert these asteroids from striking the planet. It is truly some incredibly cool technology. Just the ability to be able to find them is mind-boggling. But on top of that, what's very unique about Carl's work, and what I'm sure the government realized, is that this is the same technology that one can apply to finding enemy military aircraft or enemy spy satellites or enemy attack craft or spacecraft in the atmosphere or literally just in space watching our nation. And so it is no surprise that this is very similar tech, we'll put it this way, from what Carl invented that is also used in the detection of otherwise invisible enemy systems. This, however, should be taken as only one of many projects that Carl has worked on that also have Department of Defense applications and connections to the US government and military contracting. And so, I hate to do it because Carl seemed like a cool dude. I wish I could have met this guy. He started like paragliding and built his own paragliders when he was a kid, and he would fly his own planes. Literally seems like such a cool grandpa. But unfortunately, we're gonna have to tell the next story. Carl, being a true G, liked to live out in the middle of nowhere. He lived about 85-ish miles from Los Angeles on the other side of a huge mountain range on his own little hunk of the desert with very few neighbors. All the homes are spaced out, and he was able to have basically no light pollution, so he could build his own observatory on his property. Like, he built an observatory to watch the stars. He lived in the middle of nowhere because he loved watching the stars. This just seems like an innocent dude who loved space and wanted to make sure he made some cool stuff and used his brain for the most while he was here. And so, although a G, it is very likely he was hiding some other things in his very long and successful career that maybe didn't make the forefront of media headlines. And so I imagine it was with confusion and also a little disappointment when one day at the age of 67, he looked outside of his door and saw someone on his property walking around with a gun, just milling about, it seemed. And so Carl really likely realized that there was very few seconds to spare, considering he lived very far from the nearest police station. So he immediately called them and had him on the way and just got safe with his wife and hoped that this guy wasn't gonna come for them. And fortunately, the police got there in time and arrested the man who was walking around on his property with the loaded gun. And I can imagine at that moment what went through Carl's mind of, "Phew, I'm safe, we're all good." It was just some weird freak, but it wasn't just some weird freak. It actually kind of breaks my heart to tell the story. The man's name was Freddie Schneider, or at least so we're told, because he doesn't exist. And the cops arrested the fellow, who would later go on to say that he was walking around with his loaded gun on Carl's property because he was headed to the post office and wanted to protect himself from animals. That excuse could make sense in many circumstances, and you know, I live in America. You basically do need a firearm to go anywhere at this point. But what's weird about his story is that the post office is the opposite direction of Carl's house, and if you were to keep walking past Carl's house, you'd pretty quickly end up in mountains that, if you're not prepared, will take your life from exposure or dehydration or a lot of things. So it's not like there's another neighborhood past Carl's, there's nothing. So when this man gave this excuse to the courts, it should have immediately been a red flag that something was deeply wrong. But evidently, it wasn't. Because in arguably the most leftist anti-firearm state with a leftist anti-firearm judge, the case against this man, who we later find out is named Freddie Schneider, who had been on Carl's property, was dropped. Both the charges for the felony firearms possession and the charges for his attempted escape from jail. And it's weirder than that. The judge dropped the charges under something known as his personal recognizance, and that's really part of California's Penal Code 1385. And it basically boils down to the judge thinks it's the right thing to do, so he's not going to apply the law in this case. That makes no sense to me when this guy was clearly up to no good. It doesn't take much effort to see that. But anyway, that's what happened. All charges were dropped almost immediately against this guy, and he was free to go despite this weird encounter he'd had with Carl. And let me get cozy for this next bit. It's only gonna get worse from here. 2 days before Christmas, there would be a phone call made to the police from Carl's property, a frantic one at that, and it would be discussing how something had happened to Carl. The police would arrive a short while later, underline while, as he is pretty far from the nearest police station, and they would find a Carl Grillmair, a man whose mind should be considered a national treasure, bent over, doubled over on his porch on the floor, bleeding out. The police attempted to resuscitate the man, only to have him bleed out on the scene. And as it would turn out, Carl had been blasted on his front porch by a man with a firearm, and that man had later just disappeared. Once again, 2 days before Christmas. So as it would turn out, the man that would be accused of this crime was arrested several miles down the road for a carjacking, and that man's name was Freddie Schneider, the man who had been let out of prison for the crime of walking on this man's property with a loaded gun, seemingly for the sake of carrying out an act, who after being arrested was later then let out on an obscure and weird California penal code. The self-same man would be attributed as the murderer of this great mind. And I'm sure Carl also noticed the weirdness that the same man had come back for him and was probably even curious how that had happened. But taking all that aside, I'm going to point out some very odd things about our friend Freddie here. Namely, that he doesn't exist. Freddie is not real, insofar as I can tell, as there are no pictures of Freddie that I could find. There are no social media profiles for Freddie that I could find. There are no records for Freddie that I could find. There are seemingly no records of the man at all. Now, maybe I'm wrong and you guys can find something, I'm willing to admit that, but I don't think I am. I'm almost certain that Freddie isn't real as we currently understand him. And it's always a unique thing to me when the media gives a story like this, as bizarre as this, and doesn't include pictures of the perpetrator. This Freddie guy is apparently on a $2 million bail awaiting trial, but it's now been a considerable amount of time with no updates on the trial as far as I can tell. There seem to be no court proceedings that have been publicly listed. It doesn't seem like it's going anywhere, is what I'll say in short. But what's also weird is that there is no known connection between the two men. They, as far as we know, never met each other, never saw each other, never knew each other, never interacted even slightly. That's assuming the identity of Freddie Schneider is even real. But it's even stranger because the science community that Carl was such a massive part of for decades almost acted like he also never even existed. Indeed, the place where he was a professor, that being Caltech, published a tiny little obituary about him. They gave a little bit of detail. Might seem sweet at first, but what's weird about the obituary is how they describe what happened to Carl. Carl Grillmair, an astronomer at Caltech's IPAC Science and Data Center for Astronomy and Planetary Sciences, passed away suddenly on February 16th of 2026. He was 67 years old. Once again, hopefully I don't need to point out what's weird here. The obituary describes him as suddenly passing, which leads me to think that maybe he had a disease or it was a random heart attack. Not that he was blasted on his front porch by a guy who had tried to blast him 2 months before, 2 days before Christmas. And in this incredibly bizarre situation, the guy was let off the hook the first time for whatever weird reason that the judge described. And like I said, there's no social media footprint for this guy, which it's almost impossible not to even have just the tiniest blip on the radar in this day and age. But like I said, the would-be assassin and then eventual successful assassin of Carl Grillmair has no presence. It's as though he does not exist. What I do know exists though, beyond the connection between Carl Grillmair and the government, is Carl Grillmair in JPL, or Jet Propulsion Laboratories, and that is worth mentioning because it is a huge institution in the aerospace and defense department tech development world, and it is often focused on developing the most advanced propulsion systems, including those that could be used in advanced spacecraft, like those built out of Monica Reza's Mandeloy material. And it is also involved in the exact same sorts of activities as Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, and Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico, and Los Alamos Laboratories. And so one of those epicenters we discussed at the beginning of this video becomes very prominent. Now we have 3 individuals, including Dallas Hardwick, who passed away from that fast-acting cancer in 2014. We have 3 individuals with the peak of security clearances involved in the most insane technological development, including those that could be used in quote-unquote UFO situations. They all 3 meet extremely mysterious ends within months of one another, one of which case actually occurred within literal days of one another, that being Carl Grillmair and the disappearance of General McCassland. Days. Like less than 2 weeks apart is when this happened. Keep that in mind. But what's even crazier than that is this weird detail I found when digging that I have not seen discussed anywhere else, and it makes me super uncomfortable. Carl Grillmair lives very close to JPL, and in fact he would fly one of his planes from the local airport near where he lived over into Los Angeles, where he would then be able to go to Caltech and be a professor. It just made traveling faster, right? But what's really weird is the connection between him and Monica Reza, the person who literally developed Mandeloy, and her disappearance. because I found out that the last known location where Monica was ever seen alive is less than 11 miles from Carl Grillmair's house. What? That blew my socks off. She disappears in this random forest in this random national park, and it's literally if you were on top of one of these hills in this national park, you probably could have seen Carl's house if you knew what you were looking for. When you have two people's lives taken in a short period of one another, 11-ish miles apart from each other, that should be #1 priority for the police to investigate, but not a single thing happened with that lead. And in fact, I have not seen it discussed anywhere else publicly. But that needs to be top front and center of reasons why this is not natural and these are not random occurrences. And so here, I thought there's no way we have 4 people, mysterious deaths, weird circumstances surrounding them. There's no way it could go any further than that. But unsurprisingly, it does. I'm going to now add a very, very bizarre case to you, and we're going to add 3 people for the price of 1 to this list. So please allow me to introduce you to Jacob Pritchard. This is a story I really wish I didn't have to tell because it's very dark, and not just dark, but sad, depressing, because of the implications of what's going on here at scale. Jacob Pritchard is a 30-something working on Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, the great state of Ohio, I should say. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this video, one of the foremost bases in the development of advanced aerospace technologies, and one of the bases ascribed as being the location where at least a portion of the Roswell wreckage is kept, and a portion of the remains found on board the ship are kept. A place that was the headquarters for the eventual 12,000 UFO reports that were generated over about a decade from the 1950s through the 1960s. It is also the place that Neil McCassland ran and commanded for multiple years and helped develop some of the most advanced technologies in the entire United States Air Force. It is obviously a place that is deeply connected to advanced research and possible research into things like UFOs. Very deeply connected to Kirtland Air Force Base, which is where Neil McCassland headed the huge Department of Defense budget for the Air Force, as well as Jet Propulsion Laboratories in California, where much of the propulsion technology is created in this country. And sadly, Jacob is on this list not for good reasons. Jacob was a standout man, and I firmly believe that. And it is just such a shame with what I'm about to have to say. On October the 25th of 2025, something inexplicable occurred between Jacob and his wife. Jacob Pritchard, at some unknown point in that day, would take his wife, Jamie Pritchard's life. He then would, around 2 a.m. of that same day, travel and take the life of a coworker, or I should say, allegedly take the life of that coworker. Oddly enough, this coworker was also named Jamie, although a different spelling. At which point, and this is all alleged, I don't believe this story as it's told, but at which point Jacob would then take his wife's body in the trunk and drive it to a local municipal building into the front of a camera, pop open the trunk, revealing the corpse inside, and then remove a handgun from his person and end it all there. This all supposedly happened on camera. And by all accounts, it is a horrible tragedy and a heartbreaking one, because they also have not only the lives of these 3 people that were lost, but these 2 also had 3 children together, and it's just such a shame that they are now without parents. But these people obviously aren't on this list because of the bizarre nature of the crime. They're on this list for other reasons we will touch on, but let's continue with the story for now. I'm going to go a little bit further on this one because I firmly believe whoever is behind this has committed something beyond any imagination and has managed to get away with a very obvious cover-up. Firstly, there is no sign that Jacob ever had any issues with his wife. They are the epitome of an excellent marriage, and I'm basing that off of all the signs. And it would seem based on the obituary descriptions that the family likely agrees with that and is also suspicious of what actually happened to their precious children. There's also no sign of any romantic involvement between Jacob and this other Jamie. And I won't lie, when I was digging into this, I found the wife's Facebook, which was still public, maybe because they didn't have the password to close it down. And on there, I was able to see that Jacob and Jamie had been dating each other since high school, had gotten married in college. He had proposed to her on the Eiffel Tower in Paris, and had seemingly been the example of what everyone really wants in a relationship, even extending to the point of having 3 children and plans for more. It was honestly really heartbreaking to see, because in any other circumstance, this really would be an ideal couple. It's honestly just really sweet. And it's really, really creepy and sad because, and throughout that whole period on Facebook, I found also no other signs of anything being wrong. And it seemed like this was just a great life being lived together. And so I decided to go a little bit further than the police have because apparently the police just don't care. And lo and behold, it doesn't take much effort to see a pattern emerges and some strange findings also emerge. But firstly, the story that we were told and why I say allegedly about all those things is pretty obvious because the investigators have given zero, let me repeat myself, zero, one more time for good measure, zero evidence to the public that Jacob or his wife or any of these things happened the way we are told. Nada evidence, not a bit. And that right there, when there's not a single stick of proof of what we're being told, gets me immediately suspicious because I don't take the word of people who rape, sacrifice to Satan, and eat children, and I don't just trust those sorts of people. Let's just put it that way. And rightfully so, because we've been lied to so many times. So let's continue. When I was researching this story, there were several compelling findings that made me think that the story we were being told was completely untrue. First, the lack of evidence. Secondly, there was camera footage that this occurred, supposedly, and yet none of that footage was ever released. Not even a screenshot of Jacob at the municipal station. None of that was released. Secondly, or thirdly at this point, the woman whom Jacob killed after taking his wife's life, there was no evidence Jacob was actually there, at least no evidence released to the public. And they don't even try to pretend there is. Indeed, the police were called to the scene of this crime while it was happening by a neighbor who had heard yelling and someone trying to break into the second Jamie's house. And this person, this neighbor, came out and then saw that someone was going in and said hello and tried to get them to stop. And then that person threatened them with a gun, at least the story goes. And so the neighbor went back inside, called the police, and the police were on their way. And here we have the testimony of this woman, which was published in several different articles in a very unique way. The story goes that the woman called the police after seeing a man on the front porch, but because the audio of the 911 call was later leaked, we know that these stories are lies by omission. As we're told, Jacob went there at his own behest, possibly in the trunk already, and conducted this operation, all of which I should underline it happened alone. In reality though, something very different actually transpired based on this call. Let me play the audio for you though, and I'll quit yapping.
There's people out on their patio, a gentleman, and he was trying to get into their door. And I opened up my back door, and he said he had a gun to get back in my house, and he hopped off their patio and left.
After recording and going through that and listening to it for like the 8th time, I realized it's even weirder than I thought because the grammar doesn't make a lot of sense. It sounds like there were either multiple people in the home or multiple people on the porch and only one of them ran away. So I'm not even sure where to take that. The call does not identify Jacob as being the guy that was there. And like I said, it's either 2 people are in the house, in which case, where's the other witness, or 2 people or more on the porch, in which case, what happened to those guys? It seems like the call is missing something, and there's just something very odd about it. Let's continue. So that completely breaks down the story that this was Jacob alone on a random spree. Furthermore, there is also an officer who was called to investigate this situation and was also the one who would later find the body. The first time they were called, they showed up and they were there too late. As the neighbor described, the man, once she had called the police, basically immediately jumped off of the 2nd floor porch and ran off into the darkness. And the police pull up, and for whatever reason they decide not to go up and investigate despite seeing a ladder on top of an air conditioning or generator unit that had been used to climb onto that porch. So 1, I don't know why they didn't investigate, and 2, how did this guy sustain the impact from that 2nd floor balcony? Besides the point. The police, while there, instead of going and knocking on the front door to try and see if this woman in this apartment is all right and to chat and get more of the story with the neighbors, they instead decide to try and just call the woman on her phone, and they don't actually make an effort to get into the home and see if everything is okay. Which is weird, because after just a couple of hours of not really doing much, they would leave and then would get called back again and would eventually find the woman's body inside. So in that whole exchange, I also want you to notice that no one ever confirmed seeing Jacob there, and the police never saw Jacob there, and whoever was there had escaped. And it's also worth noting that we don't know when the actual taking of this woman's life even took place, because the police showed up 2 separate times. And so here we get a very interesting thing that happens, and it's going to end up being arguably the strongest piece of evidence that this whole story is a fabrication, and that would be the cop who had gone there. I'm gonna leave his name out because I feel bad for the guy, but when he was called to investigate, What happened is very interesting. We know that they didn't actually go and investigate, and it seems like they were maybe even called to stand off based on the very little police work they actually did, but that admittedly is speculation. What I do know though is that this case seems to have gotten him into a lot of trouble. This officer, who had a roughly 30-year history of police work across multiple stations, including 24 years of this police department, who over the course of his career had completed over 140 unique trainings and training sessions and courses to advance his police work, and was a true veteran in the field, was suddenly placed on leave after this case, and the Internal Police Investigations Unit cited the reason as being for strange behavior or inappropriate or concerns of his behavior at crime scenes. This came out of nowhere. As far as I can tell, this guy had a completely clean history up until this case. What also happens on top of this is that shortly thereafter, we learned that this officer had decided to resign from his position based on records from the police department that I found online. With the announcement of his resignation, however, came the little addition that there were 0 issues and that he had a completely clean record. Which is weird because within just a few weeks of him being put on leave for possibly right after this very strange case of this double murder homicide, he's then resigning and he's completely clean, his record's completely clean, and there's no issues. I will admit this is a lot of speculation here on top of this, but I do know that in the police world, if he had been fired after being placed on leave over investigation corruption, he would have lost his pension and would have lost all of his... My camera died, so we're gonna keep filming here. All right, as I was saying, I speculate, and this is speculation, I will double highlight that maybe he saw something he shouldn't have and it was placed on leave because he talked about it, and then was given the option of charges against you for whatever at any point in your career. We're just gonna pick something and say that you did something wrong, and then they're obviously gonna find him guilty, and then he's gonna lose his pension and everything he's worked up and this whole equity that he's built up for his family, or he's offered the chance to resign and keep everything. What do I know? At this point, this whole story is basically a movie, so that didn't seem too outlandish to me. When we're talking about the military and military contractors, there's a lot of money, and money can make people do some pretty insane things. And now let's bring in the loop of why these people are really on the list. And that would be because Jacob, his wife Jamie, the woman he supposedly went and killed, employed by the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, and specifically in the laboratories. And we're all within arm's reach of these covert government projects, and we're possibly operating within them as well. And it's not just the fact that they were all connected to this base and met this untimely end. We've also got the listings for the jobs that they were all employed in, seem to pretty heavily hint at, yeah, these guys were involved in covert projects. Reference Jacob Pritchard worked in what is known as the research laboratory, and that is where the top secret things happen. And then the woman he allegedly killed worked in the human performance wing, which deals with exactly what it sounds like, prepping humans for advanced aircraft operations and things along those lines. Let's get around to the final bit of data. Jacob's wife worked in something known as Air Force Life Cycle Management Center. And what they do there reads as follows. I just took this from Wiki because it was a oddly succinct description. Force Life Cycle Management Center, AFL-CMC, which is headquartered at the Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, so that's where they're going to be doing their most intense operations, is one of 6 centers reporting to the Air Force Material Command, which is developing advanced materials, Mandeloy, and it is led by a lieutenant general. AFL-CMC is charged with the life cycle management of Air Force weapon systems from their inception, so new weapons, to retirement. The AFL-CMC mission is to acquire and support war-winning capabilities. Now, there are already links in there to connections to advanced materials, advanced weapon systems, and Jacob's wife was the first one that we are aware of to perish. So who knows what she knew? But it is very possible that during her tenure there, she was also connected to General McCassland and Mandeloy and its development, which is still really kept under wraps. And so in other words, we have 3 more people, possibly, in fact, likely involved in covert government projects, infamous bases in all of the country, who all end up deceased in a bizarre double homicide self-deletion, and no evidence has actually been released that the story we are being told happened the way that we are told. So once again, double underline, we have never been given any evidence. It's just all the media narrative, which I think we've all grown up a little too much to fall for that. So I just realized that this video is already going long, so the next half of this video is going to be coming out next week. I apologize for the abrupt cliffhanger. That being said, thank you guys so much for watching, and I can't wait to see each and every one of you in the next one.